Farming God's Way is an amazing solution to the food security and poverty crisis in the agricultural domain. Farming God's Way is not just a technology, but a well-balanced biblical management and technological solution to equip you to use what God has put in your hands and reveal the fullness of Jesus' promised abundant life.
Great variations on vegetable production techniques exist, from double digging to circle gardens to bag gardens, lasagna gardening to raised composting beds, deep plowing and rotavating, etc. Some work very well. Others are not viable on large tracts of land, and some are ecological disasters, whilst others are just never going to catch on because of the amount of effort required to be able to get them done. So, can we do Farming God's Way with vegetables? Vegetables are not as forgiving as field crops because they have, number one, short growing seasons, number two, weak or shallow root systems, and number three, very high nutrient demand. To meet these demands, we need to have a stable and fertile starting point with well-structured, crumbly soil, which is most likely not the case at establishment year. Farmers or vegetable gardens are not patient and want to start planting as soon as possible. Most farmers also want to start with the more difficult vegetables, which can result in a negative experience. Be wary and selective of what you try early on with the vegetables. Clearing, leveling and smother mulching. Clear the garden of shrubs, weeds and creeping grasses by uprooting and removing them out of the garden area. Level off the garden as best you can by lowering the high points and filling in hollows. And although you might be disturbing the soil, it will be the last time that you do so. Preferably, if you have enough time, you can smother mulch the creeping grasses with at least 10 centimeters of God's blanket for 2 months before the land preparation begins to kill off all the creeping grasses. See the later section on God's blanket. Measure off the size land that you'll be starting off with and fence it in, keeping in mind that it's better to start small and increase your area as you gain more and more experience. Ensure that the site is secure, shade-free, and has easy access to water. Making measuring ropes. There are many ways to grow vegetables and many arrangements to do so, but we have chosen for simplicity's sake to stick to the 75 centimeter row spacing as it fits with the greatest variety of vegetable spacings. For example, for beans, peas, sweet corn, peppers, cabbage, cauliflower and eggplant, 75 centimeters is ideal. Tomatoes and squashes are planted at 1.5 meter intervals, so then you simply skip to alternative rows. Spinach, rape and amaranth are planted in 37.5 centimeter rows, so you simply split the 75 centimeter rows in half. The narrow row vegetables such as carrots, onion, spring onion and beetroot are planted in multiple 18.75 centimeter rows. So you're going to split this again in half to around about 20 centimeters. So simply split the 75 centimeter rows in half and then in half again. In order to lay out your garden accurately with permanent 75 centimeter row lines, you need to make a 75 centimeter measuring rope using a non-stretch rope as long as your garden is downslope. Hammer in a peg on the top side, make a loop in the rope and attach it to the peg. Run the rope down to the bottom side of your garden, make a loop in the other end, pull it tight and place it on another peg. With the rope taut, begin placing your 75 centimeter markers onto this rope using either colored wire or bottle tops, or by feeding plastic strips in between the threads of your rope. Repeat the process to make a 60 centimeter measuring rope for planting stations for sweet corn, tomatoes and eggplant, and even a 45 centimeter measuring rope for cabbages, cauliflower, broccoli, celery and peppers. These measuring ropes are essential to get accurate population densities for the crops that are planted with planting stations. And if they are made to a high standard, they will be a valuable planting tool for a lifetime. Garden layout for flat planting on 75 centimeter row lines. Whatsoever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. Establishing the baseline. Cut pegs 20 to 30 centimeters long. Use hard wooden pegs, steel rods, or plastic conduit. Start at the top side of the largest square in the field. Run a rope on the contour that is across the slope. Hammer in corner peg number 1. Pull the rope tight up to the other side of the vegetable garden. Hammer in the other corner peg number 2. Place a large paper square at peg 2. Run downslope 75 centimeter Terran rope off the square edge created to corner number 3. Permanent pegs down the right side. Place permanent pegs at each 75 centimeter mark. Drive the pegs in at least 10 centimeters deep, leaving only 5 centimeters remaining. Disconnect and move the top rope to the bottom, connecting loop to corner peg number 3. Disconnect and move the right Terran rope to the left and connect to peg number 1. Where the 2 loops join is corner number 4. Permanent pegs down the left side. Place permanent pegs at each 75 centimeter mark on the left side as well. Disconnect and roll up all your ropes. All the corner pegs are also permanent pegs. If your garden is not square, then by using the 2 adjoining pegs on the contour as a guide, extend each line one at a time until you reach the outer edges and place your permanent pegs there. Once this is done, you can remove all of the inner pegs. The permanent pegs at every 75 centimeter row line on either side of the vegetable garden will ensure that you get the valuable attribute of permanence in your garden. The benefits of permanence include, number 1, improved soil fertility in the planting area. Number 2, there's leftover nutrients that are available to the following crops. Number 3, there's improved soil structure in the planting area. Number 4, decomposing root channels allow for greatly improved aeration and permeability. Number 5, the soil pH is improving all the time in this planting band. Number 6, compaction only ever takes place in the walkways. Number 7, soil disturbance is minimal, resulting in greatly reduced weed incidence, etc. One of our management keys is to do everything at a high standard. And by keeping this design layout with permanent pegs every 75 centimeters, we will reap great rewards from these standards. Permanent raised beds for waterlogged conditions. In most instances, flat planting as per standard farming God's way practices is perfectly fine. With the correct layout, permanent walkways and heavy composting, a natural raised row system will develop over the years. If you have waterlogging risks or problems, then you need to raise the beds as vegetables are extremely intolerant of having wet feet. Design the orientation of the rows downhill, not on the contour. This means that your top and your bottom sides to your field will have the 75 centimeter permanent pegs instead of the left and the right sides. This enables the water to be able to exit down the slope and drain away from the vegetable garden. Recommended dimensions for the permanent beds are 15 centimeters high, 100 centimeters wide on top, 120 centimeter wide bases, with about 30 centimeter permanent walkways. Note that there are 2 75 centimeter rows on top of the permanent raised bed, and it is not a single row ridge. These 2 rows can be split to make 3 rows at 37.5 centimeters, or split again to 4 rows at 18.75 centimeters, with the multi-rows going towards each other on the inside of the permanent pegs. Once you've placed the 75 centimeter pegs, then lift the soil from the 30 centimeter pathways to place on top of the 100 centimeter wide beds until 15 centimeters high, which is enough to keep sensitive roots out of waterlogged conditions. If necessary, dig a furrow at the bottom side of the field to allow water to exit the pathways more easily. Although this is highly contrary to the principles of no ploughing, if you design this properly the first time at establishment phase, then these beds should be kept as permanent raised beds forever. God's blanket is used on top of the raised bed and in the walkway in the same way as when doing flat planting. Covering the walkway will help protect the raised bed walls from collapsing and suppress weed growth. The land preparation for whether you're using a watering can or overhead sprinklers or drip irrigation has no bearing on the layout of the garden, except if you're using flood irrigation, in which case you will need to make sunken beds. We use drip irrigation at our model farm in Port Elizabeth because the rainfall is very low, of around 250 to 350 millimeters annually. But we still use watering cans in the early stages after planting our crops. The principles of farming God's way apply irrespective of whether you're using a watering can, a sprinkler, drip irrigation or flood irrigation. Watering cans. This is the most common form of irrigation among small growers. And though it's time consuming, it is in the farming God's way principle of using what is in your hand. Make sure that the nozzles are creating a fine spray and not a jet of water which can easily blast out new seeds and seedlings. Very often farmers are watering literally a few drops as they pass down the line, which is really a waste of time. Instead, water lightly and frequently when plants are young and more slowly and deeply, but less frequently as the plants get older and deeper rooted. Water on the sides of the plant to limit the wetting of leaves of sensitive crops, which makes them susceptible to all kinds of diseases. The benefits of being able to walk down the long lines with good traffic control makes irrigating with watering cans really easy and efficient. Overhead irrigation. The use of overhead sprinklers on drag lines is also very common and probably the cheapest field-scale form of irrigation. When you design your garden layout, be sure to allow for walkways to pull the hoses through the field at the required intervals. Ensure that the sprinklers overlap and are running at the required pressure according to the manufacturer's design to ensure that there's an even wet spread throughout the whole garden. One problem with overhead irrigating is the unavoidable wetting of leaf surfaces at each watering, which makes the plants more susceptible to diseases. The water is also applied over the whole land and not just the planted areas, which accounts for considerable wastage. Drip irrigation. Our drip irrigation design is a single drip line at each 75 centimeter row with emitters at 30 centimeter intervals, delivering 2 liters of water per hour. We water new seedlings daily, but once the plants are up and settled, we irrigate only 3 times a week for a maximum of an hour, dependent on the weather. This is a quarter of what is required under conventional farming practices and a great cost and water saving as a direct benefit of God's blanket. Sunken bed design for flood irrigation. Many small-scale farmers are getting access to treadle pumps and even canalized water, which when used correctly with canals, sunken beds and God's blanket, can allow for very successful vegetable farming to be done. The 75 centimeter permanent pegs run on the contour lines across the slope as usual. Make level sunken beds 1 meter wide down the slope and up to a maximum of 4 meters long across the slope. See the flood irrigation design for more information. Canals carry the water down the slope through the sunken bed matrix to water the beds. So all you do is block the canal temporarily with a sandbag and break the nearest bed wall to allow for the water to enter into the bed. Water to a maximum of just 5 centimeters deep per watering. Don't overwater as this causes severe soil damage. Once watering is done, repeat this process on the sunken beds below. It's a very simple yet effective system and particularly useful in the dry seasons where no risk of waterlogging occurs. In order to discourage over-irrigation, do not build the raised edges too high. Some Farming God's Way farmers in Malawi water their sunken beds 3 or 4 times throughout the maize growing season, as compared to 12 times of the conventional farmers, which is a significant saving in cost and time. Garden design. You now have a well laid out garden with permanent pegs at every 75 centimeters. Next, you need a carefully thought through plan of where, what, and when you are going to plant. Divide your garden into equal portions. With all your 75 centimeter permanent pegs in place, divide the number of pegs by 3 and remove 1 or 2 of the pegs from either side to define 3 equal portions. Into each of the portions, we're going to plant fruit, leaf, and root crops and rotate them every autumn and spring, or every 6 months in the more tropical climates. Some examples of each include fruit crops such as beans, peas, green maize or sweet corn, tomato, eggplant, peppers, pumpkin, butternut, zucchini, and paddy pans. The leaf crops include spinach, kale, amaranth, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, lettuce, coriander, and rocket. Root crops include carrots, beetroot, spring onion, radish, sweet potato, and Irish potatoes. Rotations. These 3 crop types should be rotated every 6 months to allow for all the benefits of rotation, including spreading of your risk, breaking of your disease and pest cycles, fixing of nitrogen and other soil improvements. Rotation 1. In the first spring planting, the fruit crops would be in portion A, leaf crops in portion B, and the root crops in portion C. Rotation 2. In the autumn rotation, 6 months later, the fruit crops move down to portion B, the leaf crops to portion C, and the root crop comes up to the top portion, portion A. Rotation 3. In the spring planting 6 months later, the root crops would move to portion B, the fruit crop to portion C, and the leaf crop would come up to portion A. Rotation 4. In the 4th rotation in autumn, we would be back to the fruit in portion A, the leaf in portion B, and the root in portion C. Rotations within rotations. Another aspect with short season vegetables is rotations within rotations. An example of this would be if you've got a root crop that is harvested before the next 6 monthly rotation, then plant a different root crop in the same space. For example, we often have 2 plantings of carrots followed by beetroot or spring onion, and even up to 3 different root crops such as beetroot followed by radish and then spring onion, all planted in the same row lines during a single 6 monthly season. This rotation within a rotation ensures that the pests associated with one particular vegetable are not given a second chance or home. It also allows for the garden to be in a continual state of productivity, with each row rarely remaining empty for longer than 2 weeks. Instead, they are replanted immediately. Staggered plantings. Each garden plan should include a simple 2-weekly staggered planting schedule, ensuring a steady stream of income or home nutrition over a longer time period, whilst achieving our management objective of minimal wastage. This is particularly important with crops that are harvested at one time, like spring onion or sweet corn, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, lettuce, and beetroot, to name a few. Planting baskets of vegetables. It is always best to start with the easier vegetables, because if successful, then farmers will be encouraged to be able to try again. After a few successful seasons, they can then start to grow the more difficult vegetables to be able to add to their basket. The recommended beginner fruit crops are beans, sweet corn, and squashes. Recommended leaf crops are spinach, kale, and amaranth. Beginner root crops include beetroot, carrots, and onions. Planting calendar. In Farming God's Way, we encourage the management principle of doing things on time. Every vegetable crop has an optimal growing time based on temperature and sunlight hours, and your planting and rotation planning needs to take this into account. Use the planting calendar and the vegetable guide to be able to decide when you are going to plant your various vegetable crops to be on time. Feel free to make adaptations to this calendar based on your experience and locally available cultivars.
Soil fracturing.
Vegetables have very weak root systems, so it's essential to be able to loosen compacted soils to allow for successful production. Move God's blanket downslope of the band you're going to fracture. Push the fork 30 centimeters deep and gently pull the handle 10 centimeters backwards until you see the soil just loosen or fracture. Do not be tempted to lift or turn the soil. You should merely be fracturing it. Keep on repeating this every 10 centimeters moving backwards along the row line. Should only be loosening the soil in a fork width or 20 centimeter band on top of the row lines you're going to plant to allow for effective rooting depth. Before each planting, determine if the soil compaction is improved by doing fracturing tests down the line. If the fork passes easily through the soil to fork depth, then it doesn't need to be fractured. If not, then keep on being faithful to fracture with joy. The soil will be redeemed gradually through fracturing, compost applications, and the activity of insects and earthworms. Correcting acidic soils. Soil acidity is a very common problem in many soil types and climates, but is also caused by acid rain, by ploughing, decreased soil organic matter, and chemical fertilization. Acidic soils bind up plant available nutrients, and this causes all kinds of limitations to vegetable growth. To correct acidic soils, we need to apply wood ash, bone meal, or agricultural lime. Wood ash is readily available and is effective at reducing soil acidity with a pH of 10 to 12 when wet, and contains between 25 to 50% calcium carbonates. However, wood ash not only mitigates the negative effects of soil acidity, but also contains macronutrients such as potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, as well as some micronutrients such as iron, manganese, copper, and zinc, beneficial for plant health, fruit coloration, and vitality. Bone meal is made from crushed and finely ground bird, fish, or animal bones. It is fairly expensive and not readily available, but it can also be homemade by steaming bones, then allowing them to dry for a month, after which they can be ground into a fine powder with a mortar and pestle. Although bone meal has a very limited influence on improving soil pH, it is high in calcium, 25%, and phosphorus, 12%, with some other nutrients like iron, magnesium, and zinc as well. Noticeable evidence of these slow-release organic nutrients will be seen in your crop's leaf and fruit coloration and overall health. Lime is a fine white powder from powdered limestone rock deposits and is primarily made up of calcium carbonates, whereas dolomitic lime contains both calcium and magnesium carbonates. It is very basic when wet and is very effective at increasing soil pH to good ranges. Lime is much stronger than wood ash, and so the application volumes need to be halved. How these soil pH additives are applied will be determined by what input type you choose. A rule of thumb would be to evenly sprinkle 1 tablespoon of wood ash or bone meal or 1 teaspoon of lime per planting station or every 60 centimeters in the planting band. If you are unsure about the pH of your soil, then go ahead and use wood ash anyway for at least the first 2 seasons. Thereafter, do trials in your garden to determine the visible benefits between rows with it and without it. Inputs: compost or manure. The decision on how to prepare and plant is dependent on your available input type. Either surface composting your whole garden or in bands, or using manure or low volume compost in planting stations, furrows, or in shallow basins. This decision is crucial to make early on and is based on what God has placed in your hand, as is taught in the Understanding God's All-Sufficiency teaching. See biblical key number 3 in the Trainer's Reference Guide. Surface composting. God in His amazing wisdom has shown us through His creation how He designed to feed plants from the top through the gradual decomposition of leaves, twigs, fruits, etc. over many, many years into compost and ultimately releasing stable organic nutrients into the soil profile. Surface composting techniques allow this process to be speeded up for an agricultural context and allows us to follow what our Creator, our Heavenly Father, has shown us from the very beginning in the garden in the East of Eden. Generally speaking, vegetables do better with compost than any other organic inputs, as it has the nutrients that are bound in stable organic compounds in naturally created ratios, whilst also inoculating our soils with beneficial bacteria and fungi. When we refer to the compost, it is to high quality, nutrient-rich, mature aerobic compost made from appropriate ingredients, including 45% green, 10% woody, 35% dry, and 10% manure ratios specific to vegetable production, where we are wanting a bacterially dominated versus a fungally dominated compost. If your compost is still coarse after curing properly, then it is best sieved through a fine 2 centimeter wire mesh to ensure a fine seed bed without too many woody chunks. See Chapter 3 in Compost.
The basic procedure with surface composting is move the blanket down slope, fracture, correct pH, place surface compost, press furrows, plant and cover. The width of the surface compost band is 10 centimeters wide for single row crops and 25 to 40 centimeters wide for multi-row crops. The depth of compost will vary depending on the crop's feeding requirements. 2 centimeters thick for light feeders, 3 centimeters for medium feeders, and 5 centimeters for heavy feeders.
Although your first season crop performance will not be at full potential, surface composting will give your soil a great head start towards God's healing of the land, and as you are faithful to sow into the soil, it will get better and better every season. It is essential to repeat the surface composting diligently each planting to guarantee high plant available nutrients for the crops. However, when planting carrots or onions, the residual nutrients may be sufficient to get them through, depending on the soil's fertility. Manure or low volume compost. Although it is preferable to use high quality Farming God's Way compost, most farmers or gardeners don't have the volumes required at the start. Manure cannot be used in the same way as we do for surface composting, as it will burn sensitive vegetable seeds, stems, or leaves. However, it can be used in planting stations, furrows, or basins with a 3 centimeter separation layer. This separation layer enables Farming God's Way farmers to use fresh manure without any risk of burning seeds or seedlings, and allows them to be able to take full advantage of the readily available nitrogen. If you are using manure or low volume compost, it is very similar to the typical Farming God's Way field scale techniques. Move the blanket down slope, ensure you fracture to 30 centimeters deep, dig planting stations, furrows, or basins, correct the pH, add 500 ml of manure or compost, cover with at least 3 centimeters of soil as a separation layer, plant, and cover. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, but whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6.
Planting stations. Planting stations are small holes that are prepared for many seedlings and seeded plants that have a wide plant spacing, including tomato, eggplant, peppers, sweet corn, cabbage, cauliflower, and broccoli, amongst others. There should be about a standard hoe width, 12 centimeters across, 15 centimeters long, and 15 centimeters deep. Place the measuring rope on the permanent pegs, lift and drop it several times to make sure it is straight and tight. Looking up the slope, line up the center of the hoe head with the measuring rope marker. Start digging 15 centimeters away from the marker, gradually going deeper and deeper as you come closer and closer to the marker on the rope. This usually takes about 5 to 6 strikes and is a large amount of soil, so ensure that it is placed in a neat heap on the downslope side for refilling of the planting station later. Note how they are steep on the upslope side and shallower on the downslope side.
A variation of this planting station standard is when planting squashes, which are prepared a lot deeper to a spade depth and width, and are then backfilled with a spadeful of manure or compost mixed in with the soil. Furrows. Furrows are V-shaped soil cuttings 10 centimeters deep and 10 centimeters wide in long straight lines that are prepared for many crops with close in-row spacings, including beans, peas, spinach, kale, and amaranth. Place a rope onto the permanent pegs. Lift and drop it several times to make sure it is taut and straight. Looking up the slope, begin digging the furrow 10 centimeters away from the rope, gradually going deeper and deeper until you come right up to the rope 10 centimeters deep. The soil should be kept in a neat heap on the downslope side of the furrow for refilling later. A variation of this furrow standard is for sweet potato and Irish potato, where furrows are dug to 15 centimeters deep. Shallow basins. Soil preparation using the furrows technique for row intervals less than 37.5 centimeters is very difficult to achieve unless you prepare and plant one row at a time. Instead, use shallow basins, which are wide furrows used for planting small crops with narrow in-row and row intervals. These crops are grown in double, triple, and quadruple row designs in 25 to 45 centimeter wide basins, which are 5 centimeters deep and include beetroot, carrots, onion, spring onion, lettuce, coriander, radish, and rocket. The techniques for both surface composting and manure will be discussed for each crop to allow for everyone to start with what God has put in their hands. But it is definitely preferable to shift to a surface compost-based system as soon as your compost is ready, from a soil health, productivity, and sustainable profitability perspective. God's blanket. God's blanket is the heavy mulch cover that God in His amazing wisdom designed from the very beginning of creation and consists of plant leaves, twigs, and fruits, all in different layered states of decomposition on the surface of the ground. It is this blanket in its various stages of decomposition which creates the climate and food for living organisms just to flourish. It also allows for reduced evaporation, runoff, and erosion that improves soil moisture holding capacity and permeability and prevents UV light sterilization, amongst many other reasons. See 20 reasons why we do the how in the Farming God's Way Trainer's Reference Guide. Healthy people eat healthy plants, which come from healthy soils, which are living soils. We must do everything we can to encourage soil life, just like our Heavenly Father has shown us in His creation since the beginning. God's blanket is also exceptionally beneficial for weed control. If we see weeds in our Farming God's Way gardens, it is because the blanket has decomposed and become a sheet. We don't weed our model garden. We simply apply more blanket to get it up to the 100% cover and 2.5 centimeter thick standard. This method of weeding is called Smother mulching and is incredibly effective against the hardiest of weeds and creeping grasses. If you need to weed, then simply pull out the weeds by hand or cut them off at the surface with a hoe without disturbing the soil. Do this at the 1-inch or white hair stage to ensure no weed regrowth. When preparing for planting, simply move the blanket downslope of the planting area. Don't remove it out of the garden. After planting vegetables from seeds, ensure that the blanket is not covering the area directly above the seeds, as they are not strong enough to be able to germinate through the blanket. Leave a narrow space of 5 centimeters to allow for good germination. Thereafter, the blanket can be brought up against the plant bases. God's blanket must never be incorporated into the soil, as this can cause negative nitrogen periods. So be careful not to press it in whilst fracturing, or when using the double stick for transplanting seedlings. Also, don't cover it with surface compost or soil. We advocate God's blanket to cover 100% of the soil surface and to be 2.5 centimeters thick in most cases. God's blanket should be continually on our fields, whether growing vegetables or field crops, irrespective of whether you're doing 1 square meter or thousands of hectares. You can use any organic material at your disposal, including grass cuttings, thatch grass, banana leaves, palm fronds, bulrushes, forest leaves, or even maize stalks, However, the finer materials are easier to handle in vegetable gardens. You can also grow your own blanket material using green manure cover crops. See the green manure cover crop section in the Farming God's Way Trainer's Reference Guide.